And section 6.2 is factoring by grouping. Okay? Factoring by grouping, you can only do if there's an even number of terms, more than 2. So like 4 terms, you could do factoring by grouping. 6 terms, you could be factoring by grouping. We're going to focus on when there's 4 terms. That's when we're going to do factoring by grouping, because that's going to lead us into what we're going to do next week, which is, like I say, that's kind of the focus of this chapter. But we have to be able to do this first. So I wanted you to have some practice with this before we got to that next week. Okay? So factoring by grouping is really just factoring out a greatest common factor twice. Okay? So you're going to see that. We're going to be doing that. And actually, they're simpler because they're usually smaller. So the first thing we will always do when we're factoring by grouping is try to factor out a greatest common factor. So that's why we do that first, is that's always what we do. First thing is try and factor out a greatest common factor, if there is one. There may not be one. And then, well, then you're going to see what happens. A greatest common factor does not have to be a monomial. Everyone that we just did, it was always just a number and then a letter and another letter with exponents. But it doesn't have to be that way. Sometimes we can factor out binomials also. Remember, binomials had 2 terms in them? Or we could even possibly factor out a trinomial. We're not going to do that in this class, but you could. Okay? So let's take a look at, first of all, reminding ourselves what we just did, 3.5 minutes ago, because I was going to do this the next week, but all right. What is our greatest common factor here? We look at the numbers. Do we have a number that will divide into 3 and 7 both evenly? No. So we skip the number part. How about A's? No. How about X's? Yeah. Okay, they both have an X in them, so we can factor out an X. And then we've already checked all of these, so it doesn't really matter what this has because they don't have anything else in common, right? They have X's. Mm-hmm. So we put our parentheses here. What will be left in that first term when we factor out the X?
3A.
A 3 and an A. Is everybody okay with that? Mm-hmm. And then we're going to have minus, and then what's going to be left in the second term when we factor out the X?
7B.
7 and a B. And that's factoring out the greatest common factor. So that's, again, just, it was going to be a week later, but we just did that, and we know what we're, hopefully know what we're doing there. So that's our answer to that first one. But let's take a look at a little review from chapter 5. Okay? This says to distribute. So what are we going to do here? We're multiplying, right? Mm-hmm. This is telling us to multiply because we want to review what's going on. And I'm going to do this very specifically. We're going to take 3A times 2A, correct? And I'm actually going to write this out. 3A times 2A. Normally we would just do it, but I want to emphasize something here. Then we're going to take 3A times 5B, correct? So what I'm actually doing is I'm taking the 3A and multiplying by the 2A and the 5B. Does that make sense? I'm distributing the 3A to both of these, and I could do that right here. So do we see that so far what I've written up there is actually the same as what I've got down here? And then what would we do? We would take this negative 7B and we would multiply it by the 2A and the 5B.
What is that?
Okay, hold on a second. On the first one, where you did 3A times 2A minus 5B.
Oh, that's supposed to be a plus. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Is that what you were wondering?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a plus.
Okay.
So 3A times 2A and then 3A times positive 5B. And then we do the negative 7B times the 2A and the negative 7B times the 5A. And this is really what I want you to see. When we distribute, we're going to take that first term and it multiplies by the 2A and the 5B. And we take the second term here and multiply by the 2A and the 5B. And then we could continue. And just for review's sake, we'll go ahead and continue. When we actually multiply this, we get 6A squared. And this would be 15AB when we distribute these two. Then here, because of this negative, we'd have negative 14AB and negative 35b squared. Now again, normally we would do this and jump straight to here, but I'm going to be looking. I'm going to bring us. I'm going to be bringing us back to this, so I want to make sure that we've seen this. And then what would we do to finish this up? Yeah, these two are like terms. So 6a squared plus 1ab minus 35b squared. Okay, and so notice when we multiply this binomial times this binomial, in this case we end up with a trinomial. Like it goes to 4 terms, but then it goes back to 3 because we combine the 2 middle terms. Right? And that's going to be very important for us as we do what we're going to be doing here in a minute, this factoring by grouping. Okay, anybody need to see this still, or are we okay to go on? That's okay.
So we're done.
We're done with, yeah, the multiplying it out, we get this, but really, like I said, the answer is fine. That's what we did in chapter 5, though. This is what I'm interested in right now, that we have seen this. Because what we're going to be doing, remember, is we're going to be going from here and actually going backwards to here. Okay? That's, we're going to undo what we just did in chapter 5. All right. So, this is where we start this process. If we look at this, I want us to realize this whole thing is all multiplied together, right? That's one big term. This whole thing is multiplied together. That's another big term.
Oh, no, I got it.
Do we see that?
Mm-hmm.
What do both of those terms have in them?
2a plus 5.
Do you see how they both have in parentheses a 2a plus 5b? So we can actually factor out a 2a plus 5b. Now, what does that leave? If I divide out the 2a plus 5b from this part, what's going to be left?
3 minus 7b.
The 3a is still here, right? Does that make sense? If we divide this part out, what's left is the 3a. And then when we take this one and we divide out the 2a plus 5b, what's left in that second part? The minus 7b. Now compare this to that last problem that we just did. Do you see how, and I showed this step, this was actually the first step I did. I showed you that it was going to turn into this, and then we would simplify. But we can take that and go backwards to what we started with. And that's what we're going to be trying to do in this section. It's not nearly as confusing as it may look right now, but we'll take a look at it. But our goal is to always have something that's identical. Yep, that's the answer for this. We're just factoring. The goal was to see, they both have a 2a plus 5b in them. We can factor that out, and then what we have left is the 3a and the 7b. Okay. So here is where we go. If you remember, I said, and we haven't done factoring by grouping yet, but if you remember, I said we're going to be able to try to do factoring by grouping only if there's an even number of terms. And in this case, how many terms do you see? 4 terms, right? 4 terms. So what we're going to do, and you can underline these on your paper, we're going to group them, the first 2 together and the last 2 together. Okay, so we're going to deal with them as groups. That's why they call this factoring by grouping. In the first group, just these first 2, what do you see that we're going to be able to factor out of both of those?
B.
A B, and what else?
5.
A 5. That makes sense? A 5 can divide evenly into 10 and 15. And also B can divide evenly into both of those terms. So just the first 2. Now, after we divide out the 5b from this first term, what's going to be left?
2a.
2a, because 10 divided by 5 is 2. And then we factored out the b, so we're going to have 2a. And then we've got our plus here. And what is left in the second term when we divide out the 5b? 3. And that's it. Okay, so we've done our first group. Then you're going to hear me say this a lot. Whatever this sign is here has to go right there. That's part of what we're going to factor out. So in this case, it's just a plus. What else can we factor out of this second half? The second group.
2.
A 2. Anything else? Nope, that's it. So we're going to factor out a 2. So we're going to make another set of parentheses because for our second group, what happens to the 4a when we factor out a 2? It becomes a 2 and an a. And then we've got plus. And then what happens to the 6 when we factor out a 2?
3.
It's a 3. Now notice, as time goes on, if we do our work right, and I have chosen this one specifically because it will work, notice what happens with these two. They are the same, right? And if, when we get to next week, if you're doing your work correctly, these will be the same. Okay? So if they're the same, on that last example, what did we say that we could do? We can factor out the 2a plus 3 from here and from there. What's left in this first group when we factor out the 2a plus 3? A 5b. And then what's left in the second term when we factor out the 2a plus 3? A 2. So plus 2. And so notice we have taken this thing that was 4 terms, we have factored it into 2 binomials. Again, if you wanted to check it, you could multiply this back out. And if you multiply this back out, you would get back to what you started with, as long as you do it correctly. And as long as we did this part correctly. Pretty sure we did though. So we're not going to check it right now. Okay. What questions do you have? That's the first one we've actually done, factoring by grouping. So it's okay if you have questions. What questions do you have right at this point? This bottom answer right here, these 2 binomials. Anything that we would do after this is just checking to make sure, oh yeah, we can multiply it together and go back to here. I mean, I'm looking for the work too, because I want to see that you are understanding how to do it. But like when you're entering your answers into the computer, this is what you're going to type in. The parentheses with the first thing. And you do have to have the parentheses there. Otherwise, it's not right. So make sure you put them in parentheses. Otherwise, it'll count you wrong because it's not quite right. I mean, it's going to be close, but you need the parentheses to hold them together as groups, right? Because we need to be able to distribute. Any other questions before we go on? Looks like we've got 4 more. 4 more to practice. Yes.
So back to the start, 5b, we factor out.
Yep.
But
Just from the first half.
yeah.
That's why we're grouping.
Yep.
So we're grouping
Yep.
just first half and just second half, and we're going to deal with each group individually.
So as long as it's by grouping, then
Yep.
Always the first 2.
Yep. Okay.
So if it doesn't say by grouping, then
Well, and it may not say by grouping specifically. It may just say factor, and grouping is one of our options. So if we see, and this is the hint, if we see 4 terms, we're probably going to try to factor by grouping because it's an even number of terms. A lot of times we'll see just 3 terms, and then we're not going to be able to do factoring by grouping right away. We're going to find out next week. We will actually break those 3 terms up into 4 terms. Remember how when we distributed, we took the 2 binomials, multiplied them together, got 4 terms, and then combined the 2 middle terms and got down to 3 terms? Well, we're going to do backwards of that. We're going to take those 3 terms, take that middle one, and split it up into what would have been there, and then go back
That
with
one is
who comes up with these things?
people who study patterns a lot. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. And we're going to factor by grouping. So we're going to group the first 2, and we're going to group the last 2. So look at your first group, your first half. What can you factor out of each of those terms?
3.
A 3. Anything else?
Y. Oh, X, sorry.
An X. A 3 and an X.
I'll have to do the opposite.
So factor out a 3 and factor out an x. Everybody okay with that? Okay, so when we divide out the 3x from the 6x squared, what will be left inside our parentheses? 2 and an x. Okay? And then when we take the 9xy and divide out a 3x, what will be left?
3y.
3y. Is everybody okay with that? And then that's our first group, so we put our parentheses. Okay, now this one is a little bit different than the last one. Remember what I said? Whatever sign is right here, we have to factor that out.
You're gonna make it a plus.
So we're gonna we're gonna factor out a negative. Okay, now what else can we factor out of that second half, that second group?
Just look at the second group.
Just the second group,
7.
a 7. So here's where we have to be careful. We are actually dividing out a -7 this time, right? Last time when it was positive, doesn't matter. But what happens when you divide by a -7? We're taking -14x and dividing by -7.
Positive.
It's a positive 2x inside here. Okay. And then we go to the next one. We're taking a -21y and dividing out a -7. So what will that be?
-3.
Nope.
3.
Negative divided by negative would give us
Positive.
positive 3, right? So you've got to, when this is a negative, you've got to make sure you pay attention to that. And then we'd have the y still,
Okay.
correct? So that's where you have to be careful. When you're dividing out a negative, it's going to change those signs.
Mm.
Now again, notice what happened. Those two are the same. So what can we factor out of each of our groups now?
2x plus 3y.
2x plus 3y. And after we factor that out, what's going to be left in the first group?
3x.
3x. And what's going to be left in the second group?
-7.
-7. And so that is our answer. Those are our two binomials that are multiplying together. Well,
I mean, like,
once
If
once
you know the method.
once you learn the pattern,
I didn't.
it's going to get easier and easier as you learn the pattern. Okay. Any questions on that one?
Bad chance on homework.
I've got you 3. If you need some
But at
extra
least
practice,
You can check these.
yeah, you can check it by multiplying. Okay, so are we okay to go on? All right. So, what are we going to do? 4 terms, factor by grouping. First group, second group. So go ahead and look at your first group. What do you think we can factor out of both of those terms?
X.
Just an x, right? And that's okay. Just factor out an x, that's all. All right, so we're factoring out an x, and there goes my cat. What is going to be left when we factor out the x?
5y minus 8.
5y minus 8. So you guys are speeding up on this greatest common factor stuff already. Is everybody okay with that? 5y minus 8 is what would be left inside the parentheses. Okay, then what did we say? Since this is a minus, we've got to factor out negative. And what else can we factor out of the second group?
2.
A 2. Is everybody okay with that? 2 divides into both of those. Now remember, we are dividing by a -2. So -10y divided by -2 will be what?
Okay, hold on.
So we're taking this -10y, that term.
But if it's divisible by 2, why are you automatically saying it's negative? If it's
Because whatever this sign is, we have to factor out. Whatever sign is there, we've got to put down here is we're going to factor that out. That's just a rule. It's just how it works. It always works that way. So if we've got the -10y dividing out the -2, what's going to be left for that first term?
5.
5y. Now here's again, you got to be careful. The 16, we're dividing out a -2. What will that be?
-8.
-8. And notice once again, what happens here with these purple writings?
They look
They're exactly the same. So what can we factor out of each group now?
5y minus 8.
5y minus 8. What's left in the first group?
X
The x. And what's left in the second group?
minus 2.
Minus 2.
Yay.
So those are our factors.
Yay.
This love, man.
Okay.
Dying.
She's dying. She's too tired. Are we okay to go on? Okay.
Think so.
All right. So let's look at this again. We look at our factor by grouping. And all the ones you do in section 6.2 are going to be factor by grouping. So, I mean, unless they throw a little, I think they're all factoring by grouping. So I think I've looked at those. But if we look at our first pair, our first group, what can we factor out of each of those? Not a 6.
2A.
An A
2A.
and a 2. So 2A. And then we're going to put our parentheses here. And what's left when we divide out the 2A?
6B
6B
minus 7.
minus 7. And that's it. Because you factored out the A. Make sense for the first group? All right. Then again, I did a lot of these negatives, I guess, so we would emphasize. You've got to put the negative here. We're going to factor out the negative. What else can we factor out of the second group?
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay, nothing. So all we're doing is dividing out a negative. But if we're dividing, you can't just divide by a negative. What are we actually dividing by? What's automatically in front of this if we don't write any numbers? A 1. So we're actually dividing out a -1. Does that make sense? So if we take the -6b and divide out a -1 or divide by -1, what is going to be left there? What does that turn into?
60.
Positive 6b. And when we take the 7 and divide by the -1, what's going to be left there? -7. And notice what happens once again. They're the same, right? 6b minus 7. If they're not the same and you're supposed to factor by grouping, you might want to double check to make sure that you didn't do something wrong. Because they really, if it's telling you to factor by grouping, it should work out that they're the same.
I'm a little bit different with yours, but the same answer. It's okay.
Yeah, and that will happen, especially next week. You might, the process might be different, but you'll get the same answers down here. And that's okay. Yeah. As long as you end up in the same place. And there's going to be a reason for it next week. I'm not exactly sure what the reason is this week, but I could look at it. But
Because I move around the similar numbers.
oh, you're moving the numbers around. Okay, that's why it's different. But the answer will end up being the same. Yeah. And that's what will happen next week is the order of the numbers might be different, and so that might make it look different in the in between, but your final answer will be the same. Okay. Does that make sense on that one? So far? You guys look like some of you are either asleep or pondering really, really deeply.
So quiet.
All right,
Go back home.
let's go to this. Is this the last one?
Yeah.
Let's go to this last one. And let's look at factoring by grouping. Let's group them. Group the first two, group the last two. What do we see that we can factor out of the first group?
X.
Okay, an x squared and
3.
a 3. Okay, so we're going to factor out a 3 and an x squared. What's going to be left when we divide out, factor out that 3x squared?
2.
2x
Five.
minus 5. Everybody okay with that? Now notice, this time it is a plus sign, so we're just going to put a plus sign there. What else can we factor out of the second half, second group?
Nothing.
Nothing. So we're going to put our parentheses there, but what do we know is automatically in front of the parentheses? A 1. So even though we can't factor anything out, always factor out a 1. And then if you're just dividing by, notice this time is you're dividing by a positive 1, so what's going to happen here? Dividing by a positive 1 doesn't do anything. It'll just be 2x minus 5. Right? And notice, once again, they're both the same. So we can factor out 2x minus 5 from each of those groups. And then what will be left for the other group? 3x squared plus 1. And there's our answer. Okay. She's packed up. She's sprinting out the door. She was sprinting around earlier. Now she's sprinting out, getting ready to sprint out the door. But are we okay there? Does that make sense? So greatest common factor. And then do you see how we use the greatest common factor in the factoring by grouping? It was just usually smaller greatest common factors, right? Not like the really crazy ones like the first one. And then again, if you wanted to check, you could multiply this back out. And this 2x gets multiplied by this, and it would get back to here. Okay?
That makes me just think.
There are 5 of those. So you've got, I think, only 10, right?
No, it's